In the busy streets of a big city, where old buildings stood tired and the dim lights of the street lamps cast long shadows, Marco walked immersed in his thoughts. His age and the hardships of life were reflected on his lined face. Every day was a battle for him to get by, between odd jobs and sleepless nights in a modest apartment. That evening, the cold November wind blew through the alleys, but a sudden sound caught his attention. A cry, thin and almost imperceptible. Before continuing, subscribe to our channel and activate the bell. Marco stopped, looking around. He slowly approached the source of the sound, and behind a dumpster, in a small dirty bundle, he discovered a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 months old. Her wide, fearful eyes stared at him, and she kept crying. "What are you doing here, little one?" Marco whispered, bending down to pull back the worn blanket that was wrapped around her. His heart was pounding as he tried to figure out what to do. He looked around, hoping to find someone, but the street was deserted. Without hesitation, he gently picked up the little girl. "I'm not leaving you here. Let's go home. We'll find a solution." The little girl was so light that Marco felt a pang in his heart, worried about her fragility. Marco's apartment was little more than a studio apartment on the second floor of an old, run-down building. The walls were peeling, the furniture worn by time, but it was still a roof over his head. When he returned, he placed the child on the couch and quickly moved to prepare something for her. He didn't have much to offer, just some warm milk that he boiled on the stove, but it was better than nothing. Sitting down next to her, he gave her a drink, carefully watching her every move. The crying stopped and the little girl's big eyes never left his face. "I don't even know your name," Marco murmured, smiling slightly. "But from now on I'll call you Julia." In the days that followed, Marco found himself dealing with a new reality. He had never had children, nor thought of having any, but Julia was now part of his life. His days, once dull and monotonous, became full of small daily gestures to take care of her. The neighbors, at first curious and suspicious, began to show small gestures of kindness. Mrs. Rosa, who lived on the same landing, brought food and clothes for the little girl. "Marco," she said one evening, knocking on his door with a bag full of baby clothes, "you're doing an extraordinary thing. Not everyone would have had the courage to take care of an abandoned little girl." "Thank you, Rosa," Marco replied, accepting the bag gratefully. "I do my best." As time passed, Julia began to grow and fill Marco's life with moments of pure joy. Despite the economic difficulties and modest life, her every smile and every progress filled the apartment with a warmth that Marco had never known. He taught her to read with second-hand books, old and yellowed, and together they lost themselves in stories of princesses and knights. Julia was curious and smart, and it didn't take long for their bond to become unbreakable. One autumn afternoon, while they were walking in a small park, Julia pointed to the sky with her little finger. "Look, Dad, the birds!" she exclaimed enthusiastically. Marco smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, Julia, they are birds. They fly high in the sky." Their life was simple, but full of love. Marco did everything he could to provide Julia with the necessities of life, doing odd jobs around the neighborhood. But in return, she gave him a sense of purpose he had never known before. Every night, after putting Julia to bed, he sat and stared out the window, thinking about how much his life had changed since the day he found that little girl. But one evening, as they were walking home from the park, they saw an unfamiliar figure standing outside their door. She was a well-dressed woman, out of place with the decay of the building. Julia squeezed Marco's hand. "Dad, who is that lady?" "I don't know, little one. Let's go find out." Marco approached cautiously. "Good evening. Can I help you?" he asked, his tone respectful but wary. "Good evening," the woman replied with a professional smile. My name is Valeria Ritchie. I work for a family who has been looking for their missing daughter for many years. I believe Julia may be that little girl. Marco's world seemed to fall apart in an instant. He looked at Julia, his face full of confusion. There's a mistake, Marco replied, his voice cracking. Julia is my daughter. Valeria pulled a folder from her bag. I understand how difficult this is, Mr. Marco, but please take a look at these documents. Marco took them with shaking hands and leafed through them. There were photos of a little girl who looked incredibly like Julia, and newspaper articles that told the story of a wealthy couple who had lost their daughter years before. The family doesn't want to take her away, Valeria explained softly. They just want to know she's okay. They want to meet her. Marco felt the weight of those words crush him. He looked at Julia, his big eyes full of questions, and knelt before her. Listen, Julia, he said in a gentle voice. No matter what happens, you're my daughter. That will never change. Julia hugged him tightly, with tears in her eyes. You are my dad, too. I love you. In the following days, Marco and Julia talked a lot about that revelation. Julia, driven by curiosity, decided she wanted to meet her biological parents, but she didn't want to leave Marco. They organized the meeting in a small cafe outside the city, a quiet place where they could talk without too much pressure. When Julia's parents entered, they were overcome with emotion. Julia's mother, Elena, knelt before her, tears in her eyes. It really is you, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. We've been looking for you for so long. Julia, though nervous, answered shyly. Marco watched the scene with a heavy heart. He knew that meeting would change everything, but a part of him knew that he would never lose the bond with Julia. In the months that followed, Julia began to know her biological parents better. She divided her time between Marco and them, but every evening she returned home to him. One evening, sitting on the couch reading together, Julia turned to Marco. Dad, she said with a smile, is it possible to love two families? Marco smiled at her, his heart full of love. Yes, Julia, love never runs out. The more you give, the more you have. Julia nodded, happy. And so, despite the uncertainties of the future, Marco felt that, as long as they had each other, they would always find their way, united by a love that nothing could ever break. Did you like this story? Leave a comment below. Thanks for watching the video till the end, and see you next story.